Them out of the poor living conditions that they lived in Fitas.
The first time, and it's ironical, that under the apartheid regime, my father owned a house. In terms of sewage, it was still a bucket system. Our schools were all those things made of asbestos. Our infrastructure was absolutely nothing. I mean, much later we had only form of entertainment was the movie, Apsara. So this was Lens Them, and when we came in, it was absolutely barren. Slowly, as we were going out, they started developing areas, which is furtherly divisive. They put up for the poor, they put up gravel. Then the poorest of the poor would go to 2 rooms. Then you had a place called Mosquito Valley. But each area depicted a certain type of class.
Because I think what happened to us was actually very profound. I think it impacted us in ways we don't actually appreciate. Because in my case, certainly, it was only in my 40s that I actually came to see what they did to us.
What is going to be important in places like Fitas and District 6 and Ketumeno is we do find a way of dealing with that painful past. And it's oversimplistic to say, for example, that the whites who lived there and who continue to live there were the benefactors. They, in many ways, suffered from the destruction of Fitas like the rest of us. So I think the process must lead to the crossing of 11th Street, which was the dividing line between the two communities, not only physically, but emotionally as well.
Many countries like South Africa have struggled to build a common nationhood out of their diverse origins. Can we get it right as South Africa? And how do we do it? How do we build it? And that is for me why I'm interested in the Indian community and their contribution as part of this diverse communities in building this common South Africanness. The long history of Indian involvement in the political struggles of South Africa must be seen in the context of place. What place do Indians have in South Africa? Indian identity was forged through Gandhi's involvement in the political struggles in South Africa. Unfortunately, Gandhi viewed the idea of Indianness in the context of rejecting a broader black identity. And when Gandhi left South Africa, he left behind a small, elite-driven Transvaal and Natal Indian Congress. Indian congresses, they were far removed from the Indian working classes. This changed in the 1940s. After the Second World War, the broader black anti-apartheid struggle were infused by a younger generation of activists. You know, in the African community, it was Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo. In the Indian community, they were also, they had a similar new and younger generation of much more radical activists, Dadu, Naika, a whole new generation.
When Mandela and company came to the Youth League, those early years, they were thorough nationalists in a sense. They wanted Africa for the Africans. I think Mandela was skeptical and suspicious of the Indians.
Not only of Indians, but also of communists. Of course, the leading figure of the Communist Party, in fact, was an Indian, Dadu, Yusuf Dadu.
The ANC still strongly rejected alliances with Indian organizations, even though they were inspired in part by the passive resistance campaign and the anti-colonial struggle in India.
The 1946 passive resistance campaign was just so important. Although it proved in the long run that it was a symbolic campaign, the fact that it brought people together, unifying people, was the great importance of that time.
Walter Sisulu said in particular they were deeply impressed by the strategy, the strategic thinking, the whole notion, the Gandhian notion of passive resistance.
They were joined by women in Durban, women that were very well versed in Indian politics at the time, women like Dr. Gunam. I just wanted to be with these women. I admired them, I was in awe of them, and I found them brave, and they were Indian women.
You know, the key individual in this reapproachment between the young Turks of the ANC and the young Turks of the Indian Congress movement were Walter Sisulu, pivotal figure.
1952 really becomes a turning point in Indo-African relations, and I think it's an underplayed turning point, because 1952 becomes the first time in the Defiance campaign where there's a deliberate attempt of Africans and Indians to take to the streets together and get arrested together.
The Defiance campaign was pretty directly inspired by the passive resistance campaign. They felt that the word to defy was much more empowering.
Freedom Charter for me, you know, was one of those, it was one of the central moments in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Every person who opposed the old white government could come forward with a set of demands, and then all of these demands were put together into sort of a common pot.
We as young activists were told to go from house to house and factory to factory, to talk to people, to ask them what their demands were. And those demands were taken down.
The sticking point for some members of the ANC was the opening sentence, which was the land belongs to all who live in it, black and white. There were Africanists who felt that this was depriving the indigenous people of the land which had been taken away from them.
There was this Freedom Charter dream of South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and it's non-racialism and so on. It was difficult to sustain when the laws were against you.
Tharpwell was a momentous political event. For the first time, the world's attention was fixed on apartheid South Africa. The atrocities, the repression, its inhuman ways were exposed.
After Sharpeville, when 69 people were just shot in cold blood, the tide had turned and armed struggle had to take place. People like Yusuf Kachalia, armed struggle, he said, will distract us from political organizing. So the Gandhian notion, I think, was very influential throughout the history of MK.
The romanticism of carrying a gun, being part of a fighting force, however putative that has been, was too great. Whereas with Black consciousness, it was avowedly a position that we are not going to participate in anything where we're involved in killing people. We're not going to be involved in a violent movement. If you like, we're a classic non-violent organization. The only two native ideologies to emerge in South Africa in modern times has been apartheid and Black consciousness.
I went to a meeting which was being addressed by Steve Biko, and it really was an inspiring afternoon, a very crowded church hall, a very intimidating presence of security police, and this charismatic and very articulate, young African leader walks out, and he captivates me. Basically, you have a choice, a choice between, accepting apartheid or fighting apartheid.
It was a very powerful idea of being black as opposed to being Indian. The politics was new and changed from what the Congress movement had presented prior to that. The notion that we were not Indian but we were black, as opposed to non-white as defined by the apartheid state.
apartheid tried to create these divisions. And so for us, as activists in the 80s, there was intense resistance towards being defined as part of an Indian community. We're part of the black community. And Steve Biko promoted the notion that there's black solidarity amongst the oppressed.
Because if you take the white out of non-white, what are you left with? A negative, a non. And we're not nihilists, we are positive. Black consciousness is a humanism.
Early 1970s, parallel with black consciousness, there was also a new revitalization of the trade union movement. Indian activists again played a very crucial role.
In the larger South African context, the trade union movement was probably the most important front of building the power of a liberation movement in the country post-70.
There was a very enthusiastic endorsement of trade unions and the effectiveness of trade unions going back to the 1920s.
Indian workers were incredibly militant because they were one of the earliest unionized workers in the 50s. Those unions, which were pretty militant and associated with the ANC, experienced a number of strikes in which Indian workers in many factories were victimized.
Organizing Indian workers was always frustrating, yet they were not opposed to and they were not against. They would just be extremely wary of what could happen in what they saw eventually as a conflict between the white rulers and the majority African in the country.
From the 70s onwards, the nationalist government started with a strategy of segregating different components of the black community and creating institutions designed to support the apartheid government.
The South African Indian Council was a body set up by the apartheid government as to be the representatives of the Indian community within the apartheid state.
We opposed that and the opposition continued. So while the South African Indian Council elections were held when we were in prison, the opposition was clear, it was palpable, so there was no hope for any respectable segment of the liberation movement to participate.
Movements like the Natal Indian Congress mobilized the community against participation.
Towards the end of 84, into 85 and 86, where internecine clashes began to develop. That period is one of the low points in South Africa's political liberation history because it created things like the necklace, where we turned on each other instead of focused on who was the enemy. We found enemies in our own ranks, and largely because we weren't solidified internally.
In the 1980s, the United Democratic Front was formed by local activists. The greatest civil movement, I think, seen in the African context. And for me, the underlying attempt was to forge a common South African identity.
It was a front of all movements that stood for democracy and that was against the apartheid government. And the key leadership and its thrust was an ANC thrust. It linked in, it reforged that link that was broken when the ANC was exiled.
Non-racial citizenship is engraved in our democratic constitution. But many of the social and class divisions of the apartheid era remain with us. Discussions today about Indian identity and the place of Indians in South Africa are part of a larger ongoing dialogue about nation building. It requires that we celebrate our differences, especially since a new generation of immigrants has come to South Africa from the rest of the continent and South Asia. These new strangers, often traveling along the routes of the old, will also be part of defining South Africa's future.
When you think about the 50s and 60s, and you think about the Indian congresses adopting the Freedom Charter. You think about the people who went to Robben Island. You think about the major liberation figures. There's something very powerful about how this community organized itself and what it attached its star to.
In writing up this history, you can't just glorify it. I think there are a lot of people, events, and issues that need to be addressed. So the one unresolved issue which continues into the present is the whole thing of Indian-African, the tense relationship. And that's something that I think needs to be resolved.
We come from very diverse origins in this country, but we are ultimately South African. Commemorations are extremely significant. We're not celebrating a system, we're commemorating actually the hardships of all those who came from India to seek a better life.
So I think at the end of the day, South Africa is the melting pot. It's where the North meets the South, the East meets the West. That's our strength. That's what makes us a laboratory. That's what makes us a remarkable nation.
I hope that this commemoration will be a way of remembering a past that again must inform the future.
So for me, the 150 years is about us grabbing history so we can live and make decisions in the present.
I wouldn't want such a commemoration to lead to Indian chauvinism and to lead to, that Indian culture is the best and we need to preserve this. And I think we really need to be South African citizens. And that is the most important thing.
150 years is almost a nostalgia for the apartheid ghettoized way of us looking at being Indian. It's a parochialism that is very uniquely South Africa.
The Indian cultural traditions, whether it be Hindu, Tamil, Muslim, have enriched this country. And I think that's what we should remember, is bring those rich traditions to bear on the cultural development in South Africa, but as South Africans.
That added thing that we got since 1860, and that's what we celebrate today.
The Indian community is not really a community. Apartheid accelerated their singularity, but there are major differences. So you'll get a variety of organizations, and even though you have just over 1 million people, you probably have 2 million voices.
Every time you have these anniversaries, actually they're quite good for people to reflect on, at one level, to reflect on who they are.
It's about throwing out ideas. It's about asking deep questions about identity.
I am in the state where I'm African and not African. I'm Indian, I'm not Indian. And trying to work that out, I think I'm wonderfully colored Indian African. And I think that's what for me is South African.
I would call myself one South African.
I see myself as a human being, not really as a person of color as such.
I'm a unique woman, unique African Muslim woman.
Yes, I am a woman first and foremost, definitely.
I'm a South African.
I'm a housewife.
Basically all I am is a provider.
I wouldn't actually say that I am an Indian, but of the Hindi nationality.
I'm a South African girl, I suppose.
I'm an Indian. I would prefer myself as a South African Indian.
I would regard myself as Indian South African.
I'm a father of 3 beautiful girls, happily married.
What defines me is the person I am, I am Brandon Pillay, this 29-year-old that's living in South Africa, that's ambitious, that's willing to take on challenges. So that's me.
My name is Diane and I'm a proud Indian South African.
I'm an Indian, but I'm a South African.
I am South African.
I'm hungry. Indian,
Tamil, Hindu.
Well, I'm an Indian and a South African.
Who am I? I've been called an Indian, South African Indian, Indian South African, Kuli, Amakula, Amandia, Charo. Who am I? I am, like my father and my mother and their fathers and their mothers before them, a cane cutter, housewife, mendicant, market gardener, shit bucket carrier, factory worker, midwife, freedom fighter, trade unionist, builder of schools, of orphanages, poet, writer, nurse. They will not displace me, though I feel the weight of history, for I know who I am. I am an African.
Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Krishna Krishna Hare 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 Rama Hare